Okay, so we're going to start this special CMS policy speaker series. We're honored today on having and welcoming Phil Duffy, who is the climate science advisor at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, along with Dr. Ken Jocks, program manager at NASA Earth Science Division in NASA headquarters, and Grace Hu from the Office of Management and Budget, the Science and Space and the Space Branch. This is part of the Carbon Monitoring System Policy Speaker Series. For those of you who don't know about the CMS program, we're seeing here our new website. You can go to carbon.nasa.gov and you can learn more about this program. We just revamped this website. It is more user friendly, it has more visualizations. Just quickly, you can go here, learn more about the different projects that we have. You can learn more about the stakeholder engagement efforts that we conduct. You can learn about the success stories, how some of the organizations are partnering with CMS funded scientists and are using some of these NASA funded products for decision making context. And also, you can go here in resources and you can download our latest phase two synthesis report to learn more about the scope, findings, gaps, and the recommended next steps for this program. So I'm going to leave it there. And also, before going to the speakers, I just want to welcome the CMS Science Team Lead, George Hurt, who is going to give a brief welcome and talk briefly about the CMS program. George.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adil, and thank you all for attending. Just briefly to help set the context, the NASA Carbon Monitoring System was initiated in 2010 in response to congressional direction. Since that time, we've had over 100 projects prototyping capabilities for monitoring, reporting, and verifying carbon stocks and fluxes around the world. More than 600 publications, downloaded more than 54,000 times. Key to all of this progress has been, in addition to the great science, has been the active role of stakeholders in helping guide the development of these products and ultimately ensuring that they get used. Also key has been several important interagency collaborations with many different federal agencies to develop these products. And I'm anxious to hear from our speakers about the framework for having more interagency collaboration on this type of research. So thank you very much.
Thank you, George. We're just going to stop sharing here for a moment. And before welcoming our main speaker today, Phil Duffy from the White House OSTP, we wanted to also give the opportunity to Ken Jocks, program manager at NASA Earth Science Division, NASA headquarters, to give some welcoming remarks and put into context this request for information on the federal strategy to advance an integrated U.S. greenhouse gas monitoring and information system. That is what we're going to be talking about today. So, Ken.
Thanks, Adil. I've been involved with CMS from the very beginning, primarily because I have been the program scientist for the series of OCO satellites over the years. And since the atmospheric version of carbon is one of the big pieces of the carbon picture, I have been involved, but I have not been alone. Diane Wickland was initially kind of my right and left hand person for this, and now it's been Hank Margolis and Mike Valkowski, and from the wet carbon side, Laura Lorenzoni is all involved. So this is a big program that requires a lot of attention on our part. So how does CMS tie into this new White House effort? So we have actually briefed OMB on what's been going on with CMS through the years. CMS is a unique program for NASA because it kind of bridges the research realm, that what we do in NASA, with what our more traditional applied science program is, and we're kind of a fusing of those two in many ways. And with our briefings to OMB over the years, they were well aware of what we're doing. And when they had this new initiative started up at the White House, obviously NASA got involved. And from the greenhouse gas perspective, I was the chosen person for NASA to kind of be the NASA point person for. But I'm not alone. I have partners in crime. Um, so James Whetstone from NIST and Ariel Stein are my co-leads for one of the technical working groups. There's the other technical working group on forestry and agriculture, which Brad Dorn is involved with from NASA with other agencies as well. But all of our work has been led primarily by Phil and by Grace. So they've been leading the effort, and I will hand it over to them to tell us about where we are right now.
Thank you, Ken. And I think Phil, we can take now Phil, and you're going to share the screen. After Phil, we'll have Grace from OMB giving some remarks, and then we'll have a Q&A and discussion with everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Adil, and thank you all for joining. And I want to take the opportunity to thank my colleagues, Grace Hu from OMB and Ken Jux, who you just heard from, who have worked tirelessly on this effort for about the last year. Can you all see the screen now?
Yes, we can see Phil.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, super, thanks. Again, thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much for your interest. This is a super important topic, as you all know. And what I want to do is just spend about 15 minutes and sketch out this initiative, which is moving us towards an integrated U.S. System for better monitoring and measurement of greenhouse gas emissions and removals from the atmosphere. And so what I want to do is start by outlining some policy-related motivations, talk in a very high level about what an ideal monitoring system would look like, and then I'll describe some of the steps that we've taken towards getting there. And I'll describe the interagency working group, which Ken Jux just mentioned. I'll tell you just briefly about what's in the draft federal strategy, which is now out for public comments, and then make some concluding remarks. Okay, so why are we doing this and why now? And a number of factors converge towards making this propitious at this moment. And one, of course, is you all know that the United States has made, this administration has made very ambitious commitments to reduce our economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously, we need to be able to track progress towards those very, very high-level goals. So that's an important goal, but it's not the only one. And ideally, an effective measurement and monitoring system would allow us not only to track progress towards goals, but accelerate progress towards those goals by giving us good feedback along the way about what's working well and what's not working well. And so one of the things we want a monitoring system to do is to be able to assess the effectiveness of specific greenhouse gas mitigation policies and actions. And we also want a monitoring system to be able to inform and accelerate efforts by folks who are undertaking to reduce their emissions. And I think you all have seen examples of cities who want to reduce emissions who end up spending a lot of time first measuring those emissions. And those efforts and similar efforts by others could be accelerated if at a federal level we did a better job of characterizing emissions at that scale. The other, one of the other driving factors is technology advances. There's a lot of exciting new work on different forms of measurement, on modeling. Some of this is going on inside of the federal government. Some of it is going on elsewhere, including other national country governments, but also in the academic world, in the NGO world, and in the private sector. And as we'll discuss, one of the things we want to do, and one of the things we're looking for your advice on, is how to better integrate all of that broader universe of activities into this federal effort. And finally, as more and more folks get on board with ambitious mitigation targets, there's a growing demand from a range of users for good quality, trustworthy information about greenhouse gas emissions and removal. So for all of those reasons, this administration is making it a priority to enhance our ability to measure greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And I'll talk in a moment about some of what we're doing, but first I want to just sketch out what an ideal monitoring system would look like. And I've used the phrase emissions and removals to emphasize the point that we want to characterize greenhouse gas sinks as well as greenhouse gas sources. We want to measure emissions and removals from natural sources, from biogenic sources, as well as from human sources, because in the end, the atmosphere and the climate system don't care where emissions come from. We want, obviously, ultimately to characterize and measure all important greenhouse gases. For this effort, we will focus mostly, but not exclusively, on carbon dioxide and methane. Looking at a global scope is important. We will initially focus on the United States. Similarly, we need high granularity in space and time. And this is particularly important because, as you know, many important sources of emissions are highly intermittent. And so it takes frequent measurements to characterize them accurately. Granularity in space is important, I think, for reasons which I think are obvious. And similarly, it's important to have prompt reporting, right? Getting the information into the hands of people who can use it quickly is essential for them to be able to act on that information in an effective manner. And as I'm going to describe in a bit more detail, the broad approach that we're planning to take at a high level to address these goals is to try to integrate physical measurements of greenhouse gas concentrations and fluxes with activity-based data. Activity-based data meaning data on human activities which generate emissions rather than emissions data themselves. And I'll describe, I think you all know, but I'll describe in a moment why we think that is an effective approach going forward. And finally, none of this matters unless the data are made accessible and usable. So as I think Ken mentioned about a year ago, the White House formed an interagency working group to move towards these goals. This is co-led by three offices in the White House, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which I represent, the Office of Management and Budget, which is represented here by Grace Hu. And when I'm done, you're going to hear a few remarks from Grace. And by the Climate Policy Office, which I think is formally known as the Office of Domestic Climate Policy. The working group involves 10 federal agencies. They're listed here. I'll just mention that, well, you will see what I would call the usual suspects of research agencies, but they're also included here are some agencies which are more consumers of greenhouse gas information rather than producers of that information. Okay, so how are we doing this? Again, the office is co-led, the working group, I'm sorry, is co-led by three White House offices. It's staffed by a mix of high-level career folks and program leads from the agencies I just showed you. As Ken Jux mentioned, we have formed two so-called technical working groups with each with a specific focus. The first is focused on the agriculture and forest sectors, which, as you know, while the agriculture sector is a significant source of emissions, the forest sector presently is a significant sink of emissions. We've created a separate focus area on these sectors because of their importance. The second working group is sketching out or designing a broader framework for an integrated first national greenhouse gas monitoring system. And the third component of the effort, which is less mature, is about getting the data into the hands of users. And here, NASA, in collaboration with other agencies, is going to develop prototype capabilities for doing this. And this is, along with everything else, this is one of the areas we particularly would like to hear your input on. Okay, so where are we now? I mean, the first thing we did is look across the government and assess capabilities and gaps. We have, as I mentioned, developed a draft federal strategy for a proposed integrated monitoring system. And part of that strategy is a number of demonstration projects, which we sometimes refer to as use cases, but essentially pilot projects which focus on areas of important emissions which may not be well characterized. I'll describe these in a moment in a bit more detail, but we want to look at emissions from coal mines, emissions, especially methane emissions from oil and gas production, emissions from urban and surrounding regions, emissions from landfills, and we also want to do pilot project on some form of on biogenic emissions from, we're calling it, from natural systems. What that is exactly is to be determined. And I'll just say that here in this context, since we have a separate focus on the ag and forest sectors, natural systems means either unmanaged lands or wetlands. And finally, we're working on increasing interagency alignment, and we're starting the process of through this public comment process, starting the process rather of involving non-U.S. government entities. Okay, so what's in the strategy? Well, first of all, this is again out for public comment. I'll show you the link in a moment. The deadline for submitting comments is April 4th. What's in the strategy is pretty straightforward. There's some introductory material. We discuss a broad framework. We discuss some near-term approaches, which I'll mention. We discuss demonstration projects, and we discuss linkages with international efforts, which also at this point are fairly immature for the most part. One thing that's not in there in any detail is a discussion of emissions from the agriculture and forest sectors. And again, we recognize the importance of these, and because precisely for that reason, those will be discussed in a separate plan, which will be released soon by USDA. And I'll say that the doing these separately is not part of some grand strategy. It's simply that the plan for the ag and forest sector was a little bit behind, and we didn't want to delay the release of the broader strategy. So the prototype system that we have in mind has the goal of combining the accuracy of approaches based on atmospheric measurement with the granularity of activity-based approaches, sometimes referred to as bottom-up approaches. And so the idea is to combine and integrate atmospheric-based measurements with activity-based prior estimates. And again, the goal here is to achieve a combination of the granularity that the activity-based approaches can offer with the accuracy of the atmospheric-based approaches. And achieving this convergence at a large geographic scale, we expect to be challenging and will take time, but that seems like the direction that would be most profitable for us to go, at least in the near term. And to do this, we will combine atmospheric measurements from current and planned research activities. We will integrate activity-based data from a number of federal agencies, and as I discussed, we seek also to work with folks in the academic sectors, in the NGO world, in the private sector, and incorporate a lot of the work, as much as possible, of the work that they're doing as well. I want to just spend a moment and just sketch out some of the demonstration projects that we have in mind. One of those is on oil and gas production. And as you know, this is, well, it's an important and poorly characterized source of emissions, particularly methane emissions. Our approach here is to bring a number of agencies together to work in the Permian Basin and elsewhere to use a multi-tiered observing approach, meaning surface, airborne, and satellite observations. One of those will be, we think, NASA's EMIT instrument, which, as you know, was not designed for greenhouse gas measurement, but turns out can be useful for that. Involve measurements, methane measurements, some from DOE, which is developing some innovative technologies. And as you all know, there's some important and useful work going on outside of government in characterizing oil and gas emissions, and we want to integrate that as well. Second demonstration project looks at emissions from urban areas and surrounding regions. As you know, these are big sources of emissions. What we plan to do here is to build on NIST, National Institute for Science and Technology, urban testbed program. And what we want to do is integrate some new satellite-based and airborne-based measurements with and also aim towards more frequently updated urban scale emissions. Landfills, as you know, are an important and poorly characterized source of methane emissions. And here again, we want to combine atmospheric and activity-based data from a number of sources. Our goal here is to try to characterize the time variability of landfill emissions, the diurnal cycle and the seasonal cycle of emissions. And the importance of doing that is that characterizing that variability will allow us to measure the annual emissions more accurately with fewer observations. And landfills are one of many areas where our observations are sparser than we would like them to be. And I mentioned that we want to do a demonstration project on emissions from natural systems. What that will be specifically is to be determined. We welcome your thoughts on that. You know that emissions from natural biogenic sources can be significant. They can be hard to measure because they can be diffuse. And you also understand that it's critically important to be able to separate anthropogenic from biogenic sources of emissions. So in general, how we want to approach getting this done is through enhancing and expanding measurement networks, refining some of our modeling and data assimilation capabilities. And here, one of the key challenges we've identified is translating measurements of atmospheric concentrations, particularly satellite-based OCO type measurements, which give you column measurements of concentrations, translating those measurements into surface fluxes or emissions. Another important challenge, which is really critical, is taking good capabilities which have been developed during short-term research projects and translating those to operation. And the world is littered with wonderful data sets that were produced during a 3-year research project, and when the research project expired, it's not that the capability is lost, but the data set is no longer updated. So there's a lot of good stuff that's been demonstrated in the research mode that we need to make continuous and operational. There's a lot we can do by better coordinating across the United States government. There's a lot we can do by better coordinating with entities outside of the US government. And all of this, we believe, will allow us to produce better data products that better meet user needs. So I've already told you a bit about what's in the demonstration project, so I won't repeat, the draft federal strategy, so I won't repeat that. I'll just say, well, here's the link for where you can find it. You can also find it by Googling draft federal strategy for greenhouse gas monitoring. That's probably easier to remember. Deadline for comments, again, is April 4th. And so please take the time to look. It's not very long, it's 12 pages or something. And we really want to hear from you. And I'll just say, just in closing, what we intend to do is when we get your comments, we will revise the strategy. We will refine our thoughts on demonstration projects. And perhaps most importantly, we will then begin to take the next steps on improving U.S. government engagement and coordination with folks who are working on these issues outside of the government. So that's all from me. And I know that there's probably a lot of questions. I think we want to turn the floor over next to my colleague, Grace Hu from the Office of Management and Budget.
Great, thanks, Phil. So hello, everyone. I'm Grace. I'm from the Office of Management and Budget. So like OSTP, where Phil's from, OMB is part of the Executive Office of the President. Our mission is to serve the President in implementing his or her vision across the executive branch. Unlike other parts of the White House, we're mostly career staff, so we stay on from administration to administration. So when Ken said earlier, over the years, NASA's briefed OMB about CMS, yeah, that's because we've been around. Like we've provided continuity from administration to administration, and I myself have been working on NASA specifically since 2013. So in addition to our role in developing the president's budget, which today's budget day, happy budget day, we work with OSTP on science and technology issues, including enhancing interagency coordination. And so over the years, I've been part of various interagency efforts and worked with OSTP on them. And as Phil said, we're a co-lead on this greenhouse gas measurement interagency working group. So just to summarize, a key purpose of this draft strategy is to tee up or propose a systematic, unified approach to providing high quality data and information that meets user needs for actionable greenhouse gas information. And then the strategy also proposes near-term strategies and demonstration projects to advance that approach. So I'd like to make 4 points, some of which are a lot, tied to what Phil said, but maybe stated it more directly. So point 1, we realize that our work needs to be informed by users of greenhouse gas data and information, meaning this is not another research initiative. If we want to impact decisions and actions related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as opposed to simply improving our scientific understanding of emissions in the carbon cycle, we need to go the extra mile and figure out what kind of enhancements and changes will make a difference for greenhouse gas data users. And this will require the science community to reach out and seek understanding of the needs of greenhouse gas data users. And if there's some kind of mechanism or way we can make that kind of engagement easier, please let us know. If you're part of an organization that can speak to the greenhouse gas data users' perspective, we especially would like to hear from you via this RFI, or we're happy to talk directly. Point 2, between what the feds have invested and what the private and NGO sectors have invested over the years, we have collectively spent hundreds of millions of dollars on developing and improving greenhouse gas measurement and estimation capabilities. And so if you think of a baking the cake analogy, we have the ingredients for the cake. And so we think the issue is, how do you bring together all these capabilities in an integrated fashion for an initial 1.0 or prototype version of a greenhouse gas monitoring and information system? Now, this is going to require us to come up with some kind of systematic process for identifying current research efforts and demonstrations that are fairly mature and with some kind of incremental effort could be transitioned to more sustained use. This is going to require that we figure out how to target our efforts and where these targeted efforts could result in enhancement that could make a significant improvement of greenhouse gas data for users. On the federal government side, instead of each agency developing capabilities to support its own mission and its own program goals, we have to start thinking about leveraging capabilities across government and working towards common goals. And of course, we know, as Phil mentioned, we have to figure out how to leverage capabilities from outside government. Point 3, the feds are not the only game in town. We cannot do this on our own, and we don't want to. You'll see in the RFI, in addition to the draft strategy, the RFI lists specific questions we'd like to get feedback on. One question has to do with what opportunities exist for agencies to partner with external entities, and what coordination mechanisms should agencies consider to enhance collaboration with external entities to advance our greenhouse gas monitoring and information capabilities. We also want to avoid duplicating capabilities outside government, and we realize that for some information services and specialized data products, private sector may be better able to provide those in a cheaper, faster way. And we also want to know what enabling capabilities or foundational data the feds should provide to support greenhouse gas providers and data users outside of government. And the last point is just that the White House views this work. The White House believes there's an urgency to this work. And so Phil's bosses and my bosses, they're on us to show progress and to show results. We can't afford to spend 3 years trying to map up the perfect system that maybe 10 years from now we'll build. I see there's some of the agency people from our group on the line. We're pushing the agencies to think about what can we do now? What are some things that are fairly mature that we can transition now to get us to this 1.0 version? And so we very much feel like there's an urgency needed in order to support the needs of greenhouse gas data users. And with that, I'll turn it back, and Phil and I are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you, Phil, and to Ken, and thank you, Grace, for mentioning those points and making the emphasis on the users and connecting to the users, and that's something that CMS has been doing for many years now. We have a lot of questions. We have like half an hour left, so that is good. I'll start with making some of the questions that we have received in the chat, but we're going to open this conversation, and anyone that wants to unmute themselves and make their questions, comments directly to Grace, to Phil, to Ken, you're more than welcome to do so. So, Phil, we have a first question from Dominic de la Sala. If you can talk more about avoiding emissions from logging mature old-growth forests on federal lands. She mentions that published estimates show that avoiding logging in those forests on federal lands will avoid 9% of annual U.S. emissions that could help meet U.S. emission reduction targets.
Sure, happy to take that question. And some of you this is being pursued actually through a different path. And that is one of the many Biden executive orders on deforestation. And as you know, many of you know, part of what's in that executive order, I'm trying to remember the number, 14072, I think. Part of what's in that executive order is that the Forest Service and the Interior Department are directed to make a map of mature and old growth forests in the U.S. That is well underway. And that the nominal completion date for that is this April, Earth Day. And that map will be used as the basis of forest management practices, which we anticipate will offer enhanced protection to mature and old-growth forests.
Thank you, Phil. Another question now from Michael Wright, talking about transportation. Transportation emissions was not mentioned. Will emissions from this sector be included in the monitoring effort with relevant participation from DOT, the Department of Transportation?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. I mean, and I'll take a stab at that and then offer Ken a chance to correct or amplify. But in general, transportation emissions, yes, are included. As you know, I think the activity-based data sets do include estimates of transportation emissions, and of course atmospheric measurements do as well, because they include everything. Ken, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I will say that transportation in particular tends to be, at least in the US, pretty accurate, just because we have energy analysis, energy use analysis, where the gas is sold, where the cars are driving. You can figure that out pretty well using atmospheric data to kind of validate it because it's so distributed around the country and correlated with many other emission sources as well. That will be a challenge to do, particularly with measurements.
Thank you, Ken. I'm gonna make one more question on that is on the chat, and then we'll go to open the line for anyone that wants to unmute themselves. So, how this effort is gonna be funded beyond what the agencies already currently do?
So there were increases proposed in the president's 2023 budget request. And, we waited a while for Congress to make the appropriations, and they finally did in December. And so what we're doing now is we're working one by one, through the various agencies to see, okay, where did they land on their final 2023 appropriations, and what would that support? And I know, at least for a few agencies, they what happened with some of the agencies was the Congress may not have fully funded the increase that the agency requested, but they partially funded it. And so we will be having discussions with the agencies on the 2023 plans. But also, we've taken, and if you look in the appendix of the strategy, there's a listing of programs. We have a lot of programs right now, and if you look at the funding levels across those programs, it's not an insignificant amount. And we're also looking about, are there ways we can do certain things differently, or changing processes, or increasing agency collaboration in one area so that we can better use the resources we do have, to address certain areas where we think there are gaps. And then the president's budget was released today. It was a high-level budget with agency chapters, but it won't be next week. Agencies have to wait till next week to release the detailed budget information. And so I can't say anything about the details because that's not public yet, but it should be next week.
I can also add that Inflation Reduction Act, as many of you know, includes $300 million for measurement and monitoring of emissions from the agriculture and forestry sector. So that is a significant chunk of new money.
Thank you, Phil and Grace. We have a couple of questions. Just to mention, we're recording this. We're gonna archive this on the CMS website. We're gonna save all of the questions and the comments that we have in the chat, because we're seeing that we have like very long comments, and we can share that with you. Phil, this is kind of like the information that we're looking for, and that Phil, Grace, and Ken are looking for. But we're gonna open now for anyone that wants to make their questions, comments directly to Phil, Ken, and Grace.
Hi, this is John Miller. I'll go ahead and ask a question.
Yes.
Phil, I was really interested to hear your comment about earlier about the scope being global, even though the initial focus is domestic to start with. And certainly the document is very, very much domestically focused. How do you envision the evolution from a more US focused effort to becoming more global, both in terms of activity, collaboration with international partners, and timescales for that activity to become more global?
Yeah, honestly, we really don't have concrete plans along those lines. I mean, I think you can imagine as at least as well as I can about how that might work. I mean, many of the the observing systems, certainly space-based observing systems, are global in nature. A lot of activity data is not, so that's a challenge. But honestly, we don't have concrete plans at this point.
Yeah, I'll just comment. Many of the agencies in the group are also the agencies involved in the WMO discussions on the greenhouse gas monitoring infrastructure, and the agencies that have supported IGIS over the years. And so I think what you'll see is principles and the approaches in the strategy are not that they're consistent with discussions that are happening in these international forums. So I do think it may be more of an organic process, but part of the focus on the US is, hey folks, we got to get our own house in order. Just like with the feds, feds, let's get our own house in order. Now US, let's get our own house in order, show that we can effectively do this and effectively provide information to our greenhouse gas data users. But I just want to emphasize a lot of the same players are in these international forums representing U.S. interests and the U.S. agencies, and are supporting those efforts as well.
Thank you. George, you can go next.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. It's really, really great. One comment I had was that many stakeholders we've interacted with require not just monitoring, but also planning. So planning entails a future modeling component, because you're trying to get to some sort of emissions reduction by some year. And so that requires some sort of estimate of what the future might be like. And so I wondered if I didn't see much emphasis on that in the framework. I'm wondering to what extent you're planning to emphasize that component.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that's not, as you said, it's not something that's in the plan. It's not something we've greatly discussed. I know that USDA, well, the Forest Service is thinking about that in terms of forest-based emissions and starting to take some steps. Ken, do you want to add?
I will say that right now the IPCC has their various scenarios. I'm not sure where, with what we're doing as a group right now, can really add to that right now. So I'd say mostly we would all be using those same scenarios that the IPCC uses, because they're relatively internationally accepted. And they're broad enough that cover just about any basis as well.
Thank you,
Grace,
Ken.
do you know if, actually, now that I'm thinking about the CEQ, Grace or Ken, do you know, is CEQ doing the modeling? Any
There's a
modeling?
lot of people who use current emission scenarios for their various modeling. There's NASA does it in some of their models, NOAA does it in some of their models. So it's being done.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I'm not just talking about the climate modeling, but sort of the socioeconomic and demographic modeling and things like that as well, because the steps you might be taking are equally influenced by some of those factors. So, yeah.
Thank you, George. So we have four people. I have four people here with the hand raised. So we'll go to that: Bart, Camila, Chris, and Dominic. So let's go to Bart first.
Hi, thank you for the overview presentation. So what we've seen in California and elsewhere is that a small subset of sources can account for even the majority of emissions, so-called high emitters. So we've seen this for criteria pollutants, for short-lived climate pollutants. And these escape enforcement programs and are a good opportunity for mitigation. So one, I just want to see if your effort included tools or programs that may be too coarse for emission inventories, but would be helpful for identifying and mitigating these high emitters.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I mean, that is one of the reasons for the near-term focus on the landfills. One of the reasons for the near-term focus on the oil and gas sectors. I mean, those are poorly characterized, but high, big sources of emissions, and sources that vary a lot in time, as you know.
Okay, and then quickly, the other question was on hydrogen. So it's not an official climate pollutant, but it does extend the lifetime of ozone and methane. And there's a big DOE effort to create a renewable hydrogen economy in the US. So will
Mhm.
hydrogen be included in this program?
We haven't talked about it.
Yeah,
Okay,
I will
thanks.
add.
The initial focus has been on CO2 and methane, but if you feel like we're missing something with hydrogen, I encourage you to respond to the RFI explaining that. And going back to the high emitters, you know, we and the federal agencies have met with various companies over the past year who are working on the methane detection capabilities. So I think that might be an area where, you know, we think about partnerships as opposed to the federal government, you know, reinventing the wheel. And we're also, you know, are aware that the NASA EMET sensor is producing some useful data for methane detection, although only in some areas. So it's something that's on our radar, but also something that may lend itself more to a partnership rather than, you know, the feds taking that up on their own.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Camila?
Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for your presentation. So my question comes more so from the private sector. Grace, you mentioned the idea of partnerships, and so I'm wondering, are they opportunities to partner with CPGs in any of these sort of tools, or vice versa? And on the other hand, can CPGs use any of these tools to measure their emissions just direct, you know, rather than following sort of the current frameworks that exist? Is there an opportunity for us to directly measure emissions through the data tools that you're planning to come out with? Or
Sorry, what is the acronym you're using? I don't know.
so CPGs are consumer packaged good companies, so like your PepsiCo, Nestle, Danone, right? All of the sort of the major global corporations.
Yeah, I mean, I can take a stab at that. I mean, you know, there's a lot of thought, not in this effort, but elsewhere in the government at what I think you're talking about, which is measuring, you know, emissions embedded in certain consumer products, right? And that's not what this is about. I mean, we're not going to tell you, we're not going to tell anyone their scope 2 or scope 3 emissions. That's, you know, that's a separate set of challenges. And as you know, there is thinking going on elsewhere in government, but that's not what we're addressing here.
So I don't mean it like in terms of scope 2 and 3, but
Okay.
are there
Okay.
tools that would help companies like strategically plan better, right? Like so there I think right now every company is trying to figure out what framework do we follow? Are there, you know, if there are going to be a sort of like an overarching, in this case, a government sort of funded tool that's more comprehensive, which is able to capture the data holistically versus each kind of company figuring out for their own what they measured and how they report. I think that's where my question comes from. Like how has, you know, this agency considered the opportunity to partner with CPGs to sort of build a much more comprehensive emissions either tool or partnerships that allows for that process to be smoother versus each kind of individual company figuring that out for themselves.
Ken, do you have a thought?
So I will say that at least from the activity-based inventories that the EPA puts together, you may want to talk to them directly to find out how they consider these types of emissions in their inventories, because they can give a reasonable answers. They're working on, at least for methane right now, they haven't yet converted it for CO2. They're working to have a longer term kind of geographically distributed emission information going forward. Hopefully we can get that applied eventually to CO2 as well, and something like that could potentially be of interest to you. I would suggest talking to them directly to find out how they include it. And if they don't include it, then we have a lot of work to do. If they do include it, then they can help you on a path forward.
Thank you. I'll just say that the two things that comes to mind that could potentially be something that you think about in your process is companies are already thinking of how do we integrate regenerative agriculture, right? Like it's like the long-term plan, and then waste. Waste is also a huge issue, which we don't really account for correctly as it is. So it's just two things that I think come to mind to the long-term objective of this from a data perspective that, to your point, I'll definitely reach out to the APA, but as you consider this sort of more widely and I think it's useful to be inclusive of the private sector because I think we need to figure it out together for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Camila. We'll go quickly to Chris and Dominic, and then we'll go to the chat. Chris Williams.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Chris Williams from Clark University. First of all, I appreciate how this activity echoes elements of the recent North American Carbon Program Science Implementation Plan that you might be familiar with, and I'm delighted to see this particular initiative taking shape. So thank you to all of you for your leadership. Regarding specifically the Technical Working Group 2, which is developing a framework for monitoring and an information system, I'm wondering how far that information system part might go to help the public understand opportunities for mitigation through decarbonization efforts. Is the target of the information service primarily conveying information about that helps people understand past and current sources and sinks, or is it also the underlying activities as well as the potential future sources and sinks that would happen if we see changes in technology and behavior? This speaks in a way to a large gap between measuring, monitoring, and reporting, and actually devising actionable plans for mitigation. And I see a kind of a divide and a gap there where a lot of our end users may most need information about maybe it's scope 1 and scope 2. And Phil, maybe you already answered this, but their emissions profile and need help understanding how that might change if they took different pathways. So I guess this calls for a possible parallel activity, or maybe it folds into the current one in the lane more of decision support, which is another thing that was kind of scoped with the NACP Science Implementation Plan. It was one of our leading suggestions for the community. And it's kind of along the lines of also some of what George was saying. Thank you.
So I think it's a great perspective, actually. Honestly, we haven't discussed in those directions, but I do see that we could, just hearing you talk, I can imagine ways in which we could take steps in that direction fairly straightforwardly. So I think it's a great idea. If you want to offer comments on that, written comments on that through the process, I think that'd be most helpful and welcome.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say is, an interagency group has its limits, right? I mean, people like Ken and Ariel and James, they have their usual jobs, and so we knew there'd be a capacity issue, and so that's why we have started the work, and NASA's been leading this to think about what a greenhouse gas monitoring and information center would look like. And so, Chris, I don't know how far they'd go on that decision support spectrum, but we have agencies that are thinking about how you would set up such a center and what kind of data products it would provide, because we knew there are limits to what an interagency group could do, and that's why we may need some kind of institutional capacity, greenhouse gas center, or we don't have a name for it, but some kind of entity to do that, to think through those issues in a systematic way, and to do some of the heavy coordination work that would be needed to sort of come up with the spectrum from the, here are the measurements to like, here are some decision support tools. But yeah, I encourage you to respond to the RFI so we can capture your thoughts.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you. If it is okay with Phil and Grace, we're going to take 5 more minutes beyond 4. So we'll go to 4:05 because there are a couple of questions still that I think are very important in the chat. But we'll have Dominic that had the hand raised. Dominic.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Phil, thanks for answering my prior question. I did want to ask a follow-up. First of all, it's wonderful that this is an interagency effort. It's great to see NASA and the White House involved in this, mainly because I've got some concerns about where this is all potentially headed, that's going to apply to my question. But I think it's absolutely essential for the monitoring effort to distinguish between net versus gross emissions. I think there's been an overemphasis on net and not enough on gross. As Phil aptly noted, it's what the atmosphere sees, especially as we're in a climate emergency. And so separating those out is going to be vital, along with not placing too much emphasis on wood product pools, which is what USDA has been doing, without recognizing the importance of stocks. And we, as Phil noted, we've got mapping of carbon stocks already in the US, and those really need to be identified for protection and also for monitoring from anthropogenic disturbances. I think there's an overemphasis on emissions from natural disturbances and not enough on emissions, the only emissions we can control, which is that from logging. But I do want to also point out that the confusion I have with this, especially since the White House is thankfully involved in this, is there are at least 4 different policies that this intersects with, and I don't know how this all plays out. So perhaps you've given some thought to it. But we have the Paris Climate Agreement, Article 5.1, that emphasizes the retention of reservoirs of carbon, which is the stock issue I mentioned. So how does this feed into that? You've got the Glasgow Forest Pledge that the president is a signatory on. So the identification and protection of carbon dense stocks. How does that fit into this? You've got 2 executive orders. You've got 14072, which is the inventory underway, and you've got the earlier one, 1408 or 008, which is 30 by 30. All of this has been announced by the White House in addition to their roadmap for nature-based solutions. So how does this all fit together?
Phil, you're muted.
Uh, Yeah, no, look, I do think that, I do think there's mutual consistency here. There's a lot of coordination going on behind the scenes. We certainly are aware and appreciate the importance of the land sinks, the forest sinks, and preserving those and preserving the mature and old growth. So, I think there may be more going on behind the scenes than is apparent to the external observer.
Well, thanks for that, Phil. And I think it would be really important to provide some guidance to USDA because I've analyzed and reviewed a lot of their documents, and they're not heading in the same direction. And I also work at the international level too, where we're mapping the world's primary forests. And that is another set of data that we can help feed into what you're doing, what NASA's doing with the carbon flux analysis. We have good rates of deforestation, not such good rates of degradation. And if somehow that can be tied into the carbon flux analysis, it would make a major international contribution to how FAO, for instance, is monitoring this as well.
Thank you, Dominic. And we'll go to the chat, maybe like 2 more questions. So we have one from Riley Duran from Carbon Mapper. He's also part of CMS. And he's talking about the oil and gas methane community. He calls it the ecosystem of actors that includes private sector, NGOs, universities, and that they have capabilities that are generally well ahead of the federal greenhouse gas observational enterprise. So he asks, Phil, if you can comment on the opportunities to expand cross-fertilization between these communities that he was mentioning, private sector, NGOs, universities, on a routine basis to expedite efforts to identify priorities for gap filling. And he's mentioning that this is about regular engagement that transcends a single RFI like this one.
Well, no, thanks for the question. And I think there's probably no bigger champion inside of government than me for the need for us to better integrate what's going on outside of government. And we certainly recognize the value of a lot of really, really important work going on. And you mentioned oil and gas sector, and that's one, but there's others as well. And we hear you, and we're on it. And I will say that it's not. There are some challenges to working, to collaborations, ongoing partnerships between federal and non-federal entities. And I will also say that, the government isn't used to doing that. And it's that largely because it hasn't really been an issue until a few years ago. It really wasn't an issue. And we got to figure out how to do that. There's also some genuine challenges, not so much with working with folks in the academic and nonprofit worlds, but working with folks in the for-profit worlds. There's issues around intellectual property and transparency and so forth, and those are real challenges. And uh, for the federal government to adopt and bless and distribute data, it has to be transparent. The sources and methods have to be transparent, and it has to be free. And so there can be anyway some significant issues, but we're completely on board with what you're saying.
Thank you, Phil. And I'll give you, I'm going to ask one more question that is here, and then I'll give you each three of you, opportunity for like a final reflection before we go, or any final comments. But just because a couple of people asked, is there kind of like a website for these different subgroups or a list of participants? Particularly, there was interest on the agriculture and forest that is available somewhere.
We have not posted that information online. For these White House led or NSTC led interagency groups, we usually don't post membership online. So honestly, it didn't even occur to us to do that. So I would say if there are specific connections or programs or agencies that you're interested in, feel free to reach out to me and Phil. But we have not typically posted that kind of information publicly. There are a few interagency groups I know that have been mandated in law, and there's a space weather website for the space weather interagency group. But honestly, this group has started last year. We were trying to prioritize the work. And so this RFI is the first step in a public engagement strategy. And so we would like to have a broader public engagement strategy. And I think also when the Greenhouse Gas Center gets up and running, there'll be more capacity to do that. But honestly, we've tried to be prioritizing work, and the priority has been getting the strategy done and out. And we haven't thought that much about what else do we make public.
Thank you, Grace. Yes, Phil.
No, so I'd like to just offer closing thoughts. And first, thank you, and please do send us your thoughts. I will say, I think we're particularly interested in this area of how do we broaden this effort to include in a really, really substantive way, to include folks outside of the government. How do we make this a more user-driven as opposed to producer-driven effort? And I'll say that NASA CMS in this regard, in terms of user-driven research, has set a terrific example. How do we broaden that? And how do we take the excellent work that's been done in the research community and do a better job at translating that to operations? Those are some of the top challenges on my mind, at least, and we really, really would value your thoughts on how we can do that better.
Thank you, Phil. And I want to give also the opportunity, Grace and Ken, if you have any final words from your side. We'll go first to Grace.
Yeah, no, actually, I think Phil covered it, so I'm good. Thanks.
Thank you. Ken, anything from you?
I will say, as this greenhouse gas information system gets set up and going, we're going to start out putting information that we kind of already have, help get the infrastructure going, and then we'll start growing it from there. how we decide to incorporate more information as we go forward. Some of it will be decided by how well vetted the data actually are, how useful they'll be, things like that. And I know many of the names on this list. You guys know how to talk to me. You can give me your thoughts as we go forward, and hopefully make some progress as we go.
Thank you, Ken. And again, thank you for your time, Phil and Grace and Ken, for being here. Thank everyone for joining. We'll be sending, and Phil, we'll send your way all of the questions and comments that we have in the chat. You can follow up with any one of us, with Ken, with George Hurd, if you have more questions. And we're going to have next week a talk on, as part of this policy speaker series, we're going to have a talk on COP27, key takeaways, and preparing for COP28. How will next generation technology affect the climate talks? And we're going to have some of the stakeholders of CMS that have been participating of the different COP conferences talking about that. So that's going to be next week. Thank you again, everyone, and hope you have a good day.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eddie.
Thank you.